Some jobs change your life, and you don't even realize it until much later. I thought I was just there to clean some clogged gutters, maybe patch up a bit of roofing if needed. I didn't expect to meet someone who'd open my eyes to the kind of connection I never knew I craved, quiet, deep, and rooted in something more than attraction. By the time she asked if I'd marry a 49-year-old widow, I realized it wasn't really a question. It was an invitation into her world, a world I had unknowingly stepped into. One ladder rung at a time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time I pulled into her driveway, it was one of those still, overcast mornings where the sky threatened rain but couldn't quite commit. The house sat at the end of a sloped cul-de-sac in a small town just north of Masonville, bordered by a cluster of birch trees whose leaves were already starting to hint at the golden touch of fall. I'd been doing odd handyman work for the past year after leaving a city contracting firm behind. Too much noise, too many late nights. I wanted something simpler. And here, in places like this, I found it. My name's Daniel. By the way, Dan to most Dan. This was supposed to be just another quiet solo job. But the house had a presence, like it had been waiting. She opened the door after I rang the bell twice. Short brown curls, soft around the edges of a kind but tired face. She wore a paint-stained sweatshirt and yoga pants and looked like she'd been in the middle of sorting through old storage boxes. I didn't expect a smile, but she gave one anyway, polite, reserved. Her voice was lower than I imagined, with that slightly raspy tone some women have after years of morning coffee and quiet endurance. "You're Dan?" I nodded and gave her the rundown of what I'd do. The gutters had backed up during the last heavy storm, and a neighbor had referred me. She gestured toward the side of the house and handed me a key to the garage in case I needed anything. Then she disappeared inside, almost as quickly as she appeared, like she preferred walls between her and the world. I didn't blame her. Some people had that. Or you could sense that they were navigating life cautiously, maybe nursing something still tender. I got to work. The ladder was a little wobbly on the uneven brick path beside the house, but I made do. It was peaceful up there, just me and the rhythmic scraping of leaves and pine needles being pulled from their soggy nests. The gutters hadn't been cleaned in at least a year. I spotted a couple of downspouts nearly rusted shut. She probably hadn't thought much about them until it overflowed. As I worked my way around the side, I noticed her again, watching from the kitchen window, half hidden behind the frame. Not nosy, just present. The backyard was large, overgrown a bit. I could see the faint outlines of a vegetable garden that had been well-loved once, but now sat withering beneath tall weeds. There was a swing hanging from a low oak branch, the rope frayed, and the seat a little crooked. It didn't seem like a house with children, not recently at least. It felt paused. Lived in but muted. Around mid-morning she stepped out again, this time carrying a tray with 2 mugs. I wasn't expecting anything, but she motioned for me to come down for a break. I hesitated, thinking of my usual practice: do the job. Be polite, keep distance. But something in the way she held the tray made me curious. "I made tea," she said. "It's nothing fancy." She sat on the back steps while I settled on the old garden stool nearby. Her name was Elaine. She told me she'd been living in the house for nearly 12 years, ever since her husband passed. She didn't say it with drama or weight, just stated it like fact. I nodded, not prying. She didn't offer more, and I didn't want to be the guy who pokes around in silence that doesn't ask to be filled. We talked lightly weather. The neighborhood, how the local high school band sounded like a stampede of elephants. She laughed at that, and I noticed how much younger she looked when she did. The lines around her eyes weren't from age, but from squinting at the sun, from laughing too hard, from living too much, and maybe not enough. I found myself wondering how many people actually sat and talked with her like this anymore. Not many, probably. After about 20 minutes, I stood to return to the ladder. She said she'd be inside, but would leave the side door unlocked if I needed anything. I climbed back up, but this time I wasn't just watching for leaves. I found myself glancing down now and then, wondering if she'd appear again. She didn't. Not that day. When I finished, I packed my gear, left her a short invoice with my phone number, slid it under the side door. I didn't knock again. Part of me figured that was the end of it. I'd done my part. No need to expect more. But another part of me, quieter, more persistent, wondered what it would feel like to be invited back. Not for work, for tea. For something still undefined. That night, as I tossed my work gloves into the back of my truck and drove home, the image of her on the steps stayed with me longer than I cared to admit. There was something unspoken in the way she watched the world from behind her windows. Not sadness exactly, but solitude so familiar it had become invisible. I knew that feeling. I carried it too, tucked between years and memories like a song you forget until someone hums it again. I didn't expect to see her again, but the universe, I've learned, has a strange way of revisiting what's meant to linger. 2 days passed before I heard from her again. I just finished patching drywall for a rental unit across town when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Normally I'd let those go to voicemail, but something nudged me to answer. Her voice came through the line, soft but certain, like she'd rehearsed what to say before dialing.
Alice.
She asked if I had time to come back and check. The back gutter Shay thought it might still be leaking onto the porch roof. I said yes, without looking at my schedule. When I hung up, I realized I'd rearranged my day without a second thought. That wasn't like me. The morning was colder when I pulled into her drive again. Crisp breeze cut through the last warmth of summer, and leaves scattered across her lawn like tiny postcards from the coming fall. This time, the door was already cracked open when I walked up. She stepped out with a jacket pulled tight and gave me a quick smile before pointing me toward the porch. Something about her seemed lighter, like our last visit had dusted off a shelf in her spirit that had been untouched for too long. The back gutter was indeed dripping near the middle bracket. I figured the pitch was off just enough to cause a pool after heavy rain. An easy fix, maybe an hour's work. She hovered for a bit as I set up my ladder, her arms crossed against the cold, eyes not quite meeting mine. Then, almost suddenly, she said she'd make coffee and disappeared again. I worked mostly in silence, interrupted only by the scraping of my screwdriver and the occasional gust of wind that rattled the nearby wind chimes. When I finished, was waiting again this time at the side door, holding 2 mugs. I joined her at the same spot by the steps, and for a moment we just sat in a silence that didn't feel heavy. There's a kind of quiet between two people who both know what loneliness sounds like. It's not awkward, it's mutual recognition. She asked if I had time to look at her garage gutter too. Told her I did. Truth was, I would have made time even if I didn't. We stood together and walked around the side of the house. The gravel crunched beneath our feet, and I noticed how she always kept her hands close to her body, like she was protecting something unseen. As we reached the detached garage, she paused and looked up at the ivy crawling along its side. She told me her late husband had planted it when they bought the house. She didn't say his name. I didn't ask. The garage gutter was worse, nearly separated at the corner and pulling away from the fascia. I told her I'd need to come back with a stronger bracket and more sealant. She nodded, then surprised me by asking if I wanted to come inside first, just for a moment, just to warm up. I hesitated again like last time, but again, I said yes. Her living room was neat, but clearly lived in. There were blankets folded neatly over the arms of the couch. A large bookshelf, with titles that ranged from travel memoirs to old classics, and a small ceramic bowl filled with what looked like beach pebbles and dried rose petals. She sat across from me in a recliner, legs tucked under her, mug in hand like it was part of her armor. She asked about my work, how I'd ended up doing it on my own. I gave her the simple version, left the company life to do things at my pace. No big story. That was a lie, but one that kept the focus off me. She told me she used to teach art before stepping back, said something about the mess of grief making it hard to hold a brush. But she was thinking of trying again, just sketches, nothing serious. I didn't say much, just listened. She seemed to need that more than advice. After about 20 minutes, I stood and told her I'd return the next day with the supplies for the garage. She followed me to the door, and as I reached for the handle, she said my name just once, like she wanted to say more, but couldn't. I turned, met her eyes. She looked at me for a moment, then smiled faintly and told me to drive safe. That evening, I found myself thinking about her more than I expected. Not in a romantic way, at least, Not yet, but in a way that made me curious about the life behind those walls. The way she spoke, the quiet strength she carried, the hints of sadness that flickered behind her eyes like the last embers of a once roaring fire. I'd met a lot of clients over the years, most blended together. But Elaine stuck. It's like sap on your fingertips, hard to wash off. The next morning I went to the hardware store early. I bought new brackets, longer screws, heavy-duty sealant. I even grabbed a can of rust-proof paint in a color that matched the garage trim, though she hadn't asked for that. I told myself it was just part of doing the job right, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I wanted the repair to feel like a small gesture of care. Maybe because I sensed she hadn't had many of those lately. When I arrived at her house again, she greeted me with a wave from the kitchen window. I noticed the porch had a new cushion on the swing. I smiled at that. Got to work quickly, falling into the rhythm I'd come to love, the steady cadence of tasks that needed doing, the satisfaction of fixing something broken. As I secured the new bracket and sealed the leaking corner, I caught myself humming. I hadn't done that in a while. Elaine came out around mid-morning with a tray again. This time she brought lemon muffins along with the tea. She said she'd baked them early, couldn't sleep. I told her they were perfect. We ate on the steps again, and for the first time. The silence between us was filled with the rustle of leaves and the gentle creak of the porch swing behind us. No words needed. Just a shared moment that settled comfortably between two people still figuring out what the moment meant. After I finished, I gave her the invoice, but she didn't take it right away. She asked if I had any other jobs lined up nearby. I said no, just a few calls across town. She nodded, said she might have another thing she'd need help with later. Then she added, almost too casually, that it was nice having someone around. The house again, if just for a few hours. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just smiled and told her she knew where to find me. As I packed my tools and loaded up the truck, I felt it again, that strange, weightless pull that happens when something unspoken passes between two people. Nothing dramatic, just possibility. I drove off, wondering not if I'd see her again, but when. It was 4 days later when I got another call from Elaine. It's time she didn't have a job in mind. She said something about the basement window needing caulking, but her voice gave it away, and sure, hesitant, like she wasn't really calling about that at all. Still, I agreed without hesitation. The truth was, I'd found myself checking my phone more than usual, half hoping her name would pop up. When it did, something loosened in my chest. I didn't question why. Not yet. When I arrived, the front yard looked slightly different. A few garden tools leaned against the porch railing, and I noticed the ivy on the garage had been trimmed back. Elaine had been busy. She met me at the door again, this time already wearing gloves and holding a small trowel. It said she'd been working on the flower beds out front and figured it was time she stopped letting everything get so wild. I told her I'd take a look at the basement window first, though I could already guess there wasn't much wrong with it. Sure enough, the sealant was barely cracking, nothing that would have warranted a call unless you were looking for more than repairs. I offered to reseal it anyway, just to be thorough, and she seemed relieved, like I'd played along without needing her to admit anything. Afterward, she asked if I'd like to stay for lunch, grilled cheese and tomato soup. I said yes, not because I was hungry, but because I wanted to sit across from her again. In that kitchen filled with the soft clatter of utensils and the scent of something warm, she moved around like someone who had cooked for two once, maybe. Many times, but hadn't done so in a while. It showed in the way she kept checking the stove, rearranging spoons that didn't need to be rearranged. As we ate, the conversation dipped into deeper waters. She asked if I had family in the area. I told her my parents had moved south after retiring and my sister was in Denver with her kids. She asked if I'd ever been married. I said no, not officially. Then I returned the question without pressure. She paused, chewing slower, then said that yes, she'd been married once, to a man named Patrick. They were together for 16 years before he passed away from a stroke. It happened suddenly on a Tuesday morning, just like that, gone. She said it like someone who had learned to say it 100 times, each repetition wearing the pain down to something manageable, but never gone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, Subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She told me the hardest part wasn't the day he died, or even the funeral. It was the Tuesdays afterward. Every single one for the first year felt like a betrayal to him, like living through that day again and again without him. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say much. I just listened. Sometimes silence is the only gift you can offer. After lunch, we walked out to the garden. She showed me where she used to plant herbs and pointed to a small patch of overgrown daisies that Patrick had once insisted on keeping, even when they choked the nearby tomatoes. Her voice softened when she said his name now, like she was holding a picture in her mind and letting me glance at it for a moment. I helped her till the soil, pulling up dead roots and pushing compost into place. We worked side by side for over an hour, not saying much, letting the rhythm of shared effort speak louder than words. Later that afternoon, she brought out 2 glasses of lemonade and a small photo album. Said she wasn't sure why, but she thought I might want to see it. I hesitated for a second. This felt like more than just a casual moment, but I nodded. We sat on the porch swing, the album resting between us. She flipped through pages slowly, showing me pictures of her and Patrick on camping trips, painting the house, dressed up for Halloween. The kind of photos that captured more than just faces. They captured a life. There was one photo that caught me off guard. It was her, sitting on the porch steps, much younger, hair longer, smiling at someone off camera. There was something in her expression that looked exactly the same as no guarded joy. It's like even in happiness, she always held a part of herself back. I wondered then how much she had given of herself to him and how much she had buried when he left. The light began to fade, casting a golden hue across the yard. I told her I should get going, but she asked if I could stay just a bit longer, help her put away some old boxes in the attic. I said sure. Inside, the attic was dusty, but neat. Boxes labeled in faded black marker lined the walls. Christmas, old files, Patrick's stuff. She didn't ask me to open that one. Instead, we carried up a few containers she'd left downstairs, mostly old blankets and framed prints she hadn't gotten around to rehanging. We worked in silence again, the creak of floorboards the only sound for a while. When we were done, she thanked me not just for the help, but for the company. She said it casually, like a throwaway line, but the way she looked at me made it land heavier. I told her she didn't need to thank me. I liked being there. She nodded, smiled, and said that was nice to hear. Then she walked me to the door. And for the first time, she reached out and touched my arm. Not for long, just a gentle press of her fingers, but enough to send something fluttering through me that I didn't expect. Driving home, I thought about her hand on my arm, about the way she looked at me while flipping through that album, about the things she didn't say. It had been a long time since anyone had let me into their life like that, not just the cleaned-up version, but the part with attic dust and overgrown gardens and Tuesdays filled with grief. I didn't know what this was, not exactly. But I knew it wasn't just about gutters anymore that night. I sat on my back porch under the dim string lights I'd never bothered to take down, sipping a beer and staring into the dark. I thought about how loneliness wears different masks. For her, it was the quiet ritual of tea on the back steps, the way she touched photo corners like they were sacred. For me, it was working until my hands ached, then falling asleep with the TV still on. We were both carrying it, just in different containers, and for the first time in a long time, I wanted to set mine down if only for a while and see what it felt like to share the weight with someone else. The next time I saw Elaine, it wasn't for a job or a chore. It was for lunch. She had called that morning, her voice even softer than usual, and asked if I was free to come by no reason. Just some leftover soup she didn't want to waste. I said yes again, and again I didn't check my calendar. Something about the simplicity of her offer made it impossible to say no. I'd never been the type to drop everything for company, but she wasn't company anymore, at least not in the usual sense. She was something different, something still forming, that I didn't want to interrupt. The day was overcast, sky painted in muted gray, as if the world had dialed down its contrast. Her house looked the same as always, But I noticed subtle differences. The small flower bed out front had been cleaned up. A new hanging basket swayed gently near the porch light, and the front door had a new wreath, one made from dried lavender and tiny pine cones. It looked homemade, like something someone would put together in a quiet moment just to make the place feel more like home again. She opened the door before I knocked, her face lighting up just slightly when she saw me. There was something in her eyes that made my chest tighten, a kind of guarded hope, maybe. She waved me in without ceremony, and I followed her to the kitchen where a pot of soup was simmering on the stove. The smell was rich and familiar, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes and lingers long after you've left. She had set the table for two, and though the meal was simple, just vegetable soup and slices of buttered sourdough sheet, placed linen napkins by the plates and lit a small candle in the middle. I don't know why, but that candle struck me. It wasn't for light or scent. It was for presence, for saying this matters. We talked about small things at first. Weather. Her neighbor's cat, who'd taken to sunbathing on her fence. The local market that had started selling homemade jam again. I told her about a job I'd done 2 towns over, fixing a warped patio deck for a retired couple who insisted on feeding me lunch and showing me their coin collection. She laughed, and the sound of it felt like something I'd been waiting to hear without knowing. I'd been waiting it all. After we finished eating, she poured us each a small glass of wine. Not much, just enough to tint the afternoon with a gentle haze. We sat by the living room window, looking out at the back garden, now slightly less overgrown, though still carrying the soft chaos of something once loved and recently rediscovered. The swing still hung crooked, but it didn't look sad anymore. It looked lived in. She told me she'd been thinking about repainting the guest room, said it used to be her studio before everything changed, and she wanted to try making it feel like her space again. I asked what she used to paint. She shrugged, said whatever came to mind, landscapes, flowers, once a self-portrait she never finished. Then she asked if I'd ever done anything creative. I told her I used to play guitar in college, nothing serious, mostly to unwind. I hadn't touched one in years. She asked if I missed it, and I said I wasn't sure. She smiled then and said, "Sometimes the things we stop doing are the things we most need to return to, even if we don't realize it until much later." The afternoon slipped by without us noticing. Hours folded into one another like pages of a book we didn't want to stop reading. At one point, she showed me the old studio at the guest room she planned to reclaim. It was bright with high windows and a faint smell of cedar. The walls were a faded blue peeling in places, and a small wooden easel leaned in the corner, draped with a cloth. She touched it as she spoke, like revisiting an old friend she hadn't seen in a while. She asked if I thought it was silly, trying to paint. Again, after all this time, I told her, no, not silly at all. I told her I thought it was brave. She looked at me, then really looked hand. There was a pause in the air. It's not quite silence, but a stillness that seemed to stretch between us like a fragile thread. I didn't break it. Neither did she. Stood there side by side, in a room filled with dust and memories and something that hadn't yet been named. I helped her bring in a box from the garage art supplies she hadn't touched in years. She opened it slowly, revealing tubes of dried paint, hardened brushes, and a palette stained with old color. She laughed softly, said it all smelled like turpentine and time. I said I'd help her clean it up, maybe even pick up new supplies next week if she wanted. She said she'd like that. Then she looked up and asked, out of nowhere, what I thought made a home feel like home. The question caught me off guard. I'd never really thought about it. So I told her maybe it was the way it smelled when you walked in, or how the floors creaked in certain spots you memorized. Maybe it was the space between the chaos and the calm. She nodded like she understood. Then said she hadn't felt at home in her own house for a long time, not until recently. I didn't ask what changed. I already knew. When I left that day, the sun had begun to dip behind the trees, casting a warm glow across her yard. She walked me to the door again, but this time, she didn't just say goodbye. She stepped forward and gave me a brief, hesitant hug. It was the kind of embrace that lingered even after it ended. The kind that made you remember how long it had been since someone held you without expectation. Driving home, I kept replaying that moment. The quiet of the guest room, the flicker in her eyes, the feeling of being invited not just into her home, but into her story. I didn't know what this was between us. It wasn't romance, not exactly, not yet, but it was something. Something. Real and rare, connection that grew not from grand gestures, but from small moments layered over time, like brushstrokes on canvas. I realized then that I was no longer just cleaning gutters or fixing siding. I was repairing something else, something unspoken. In her, in myself, the space between us, that it started to feel like a place worth returning to, and somewhere in the quiet folds of that afternoon, with the scent of soup still clinging to my shirt and the memory of her hand resting gently against my back, I felt a shift. Not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, like a door creaking open just wide enough to let the light in. It was sometime around the middle of October when the first real shift happened. The trees had started turning, each one showing off like a painter who'd finally decided on a bold palette amber, scarlet, deep gold. Elaine called again, this time about the porch swing. Said it had started squeaking more than usual, and though it still held, she wanted to be sure it was safe. I suspected she could have tightened the bolts. Herself, I also suspected she just wanted me there. The truth was I didn't mind. Every excuse became a reason to return. When I arrived, she was already outside, bundled in a gray knit sweater, hair pulled up, cheeks a little flushed from the breeze. The swing let out a faint moan when she sat on it, and she tilted her head toward me as if to say, "See?" I smiled, nodded, and fetched my tools from the truck. I tightened the joints, checked the chains, oiled the hinges. The sound faded until the swing moved quietly again, gliding back and forth like a breath. She watched me work, arms crossed against her chest, eyes distant. After I'd finished, she asked if I'd stay for a bit. No tea this time, just company, I agreed. We sat side by side on that swing, our shoulders barely brushing, letting the wind do most of the talking. There was something in the way the trees rustled, like the earth itself was whispering old secrets, and we had stumbled into one by accident. We didn't speak for several minutes. There was no need. The silence had become a comfort, a language all its own. Eventually, she said she wanted to show me something. She stood, motioned for me to follow her inside, and led me to the back of the house. We passed the guest room, the one that had once been her studio and might be again, stopped at a narrow closet door near the laundry room. She opened it, slowly revealing an old guitar case. She pulled it out gently, brushing off a layer of dust with her sleeve, and handed it to me. Said it was Patrick's. Said he hadn't played in years before he passed, but he'd kept it anyway, convinced. He'd returned to it. She didn't know why she'd kept it either, maybe for the same reason. Maybe because hope was the last thing people let go of. I took the case, carried it to the living room, and opened it on the rug. The guitar inside was an old Dreadnought Sunburst. Wood a little worn, a small chip near the bass. I picked it up, strummed it gently. The strings were out of tune, but the tone was still warm, still full. She sat down across from me and watched as I tuned it by ear, fingers moving instinctively despite years of neglect. Then I played. Just something simple, an old folk melody my grandfather used to hum on rainy mornings. My fingers stumbled here and there, but the chords came back to me like a language I hadn't spoken in years, but never fully forgot. Elaine closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair, letting the sound wash over her. When the song ended, she didn't speak right away. She just opened her eyes and looked at me in a way that felt heavier than words. She whispered that the house hadn't had music in a long time, that sometimes it felt like silence had settled into the walls and refused to leave. I told her silence wasn't always the enemy. Sometimes it was a canvas. She smiled at that, soft, sad, grateful. She asked if I'd come again the next week. Not for a repair, just to play, I agreed. The next few visits blurred together. I'd bring the guitar, she'd bring tea or soup or scones, she'd tried baking again. We'd sit in the living room, her curled on the couch, me hunched over the strings, filling the air with gentle sound. Occasionally she'd ask for something. Old tune, something romantic, something sad, I'd do my best. Other times, she'd talk while I played, about her parents,
Ow.
about the summer she spent in Italy after college, about how quiet the house got in winter, and how she sometimes left the radio on just to keep from feeling like she'd vanished. And sometimes, she wouldn't say anything at all. She'd just listen. It was on one of those afternoons that the subject shifted. We were in the garden, clearing out the last of the overgrown summer weeds. She wore gloves and a sun hat, smudged dirt across her cheek without noticing. I almost reached out to wipe it away but stopped myself. Oh, I wasn't sure if I had permission for that yet. We were talking about the coming holidays, what they used to look like what they looked like now. She said Christmas was the hardest. Said she'd spent the last 3 years alone, pretending it was just another day. She'd cook a little, decorate half-heartedly, and leave the porch light off so no one would drop by. Said grief had a way of convincing you to close doors before anyone even tries to open them. I asked her what she wanted this year to feel like. Not what she expected, but what she wanted. She didn't answer right away. Then she said maybe something different, something lighter. Maybe she'd buy a small tree. Maybe she'd hang lights. Maybe she'd invite someone over. The way she said it like she wasn't asking. But imagining it made the space between us feel thinner. That night, after I left, I couldn't stop thinking about her hands in the dirt, about the photo of her younger self, smiling off camera.
At the quiet.
Hopeful weight of her saying maybe she'd invite someone over, and I started wondering what that would look like. Not just a holiday visit, but a presence, a partnership, a future. I didn't dare say it out loud, not yet. But the question had begun to form in my mind, silent and persistent. Could I really belong here? Could she want me to? And underneath that deeper, scarier was the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I already did. The first frost came earlier than usual that year, brushing the rooftops in pale silver and leaving a thin lace of ice across Elaine's garden by the time I pulled into her driveway one Saturday morning. I hadn't planned to be there that day. We had no scheduled lunch, no gutter to clean, no chair to fix. But that morning, I'd woken up thinking of her porch swing, picturing it swaying gently in the cold. I wondered if the chains would creak again now that the weather had shifted. I wondered, too, if she'd be watching from the window, mug in. Hand, cardigan sleeves pushed up just above her wrists the way she always wore them. When I knocked, she didn't answer right away. I stood with my breath clouding around me in the stillness, then stepped back just as the door creaked open. Elaine stood there, not in her usual warmth, but in a long, pale robe. Her eyes were tired, her hair wasn't done, she looked surprised and, somehow relieved to see me. She stepped aside wordlessly, and I followed her in. The house was dim, the usual scent of citrus and vanilla traded for something more muted like stillness. I asked if she was okay, and she gave me a thin smile. The kind people give when they don't want to lie, but also don't want to unravel. She said she hadn't been feeling great, said she woke up with a headache and stayed in bed longer than usual. I noticed then how quiet the house was, how the soft hum of living had been replaced with silence. She sat on the couch slowly, easing herself into the cushions, as though her bones ached more than she admitted. I asked if she needed anything. She shook her head. I went to the kitchen anyway, made tea without asking which kind she preferred, and brought it back to her. She held the mug close, not drinking, just letting the steam rise to her face. It was the first time I'd seen her like this, unguarded, weary, uncurated. She said the weather always did this to her, that the cold made her bones remember too much, that her body carried stories her voice didn't always know how to tell. She said Patrick used to joke that she hibernated emotionally in winter, like a bear with a broken heart. I didn't laugh. I just sat beside her, careful not to disturb whatever quiet she was clinging to. We watched the frost through the window. It melted slowly under a pale sun, retreating in patches, leaving behind damp trails and the first hint of mud. Elaine finally sipped her tea, closing her eyes like it hurt and helped at the same time. She asked me then, almost absent-mindedly, if I ever thought about growing old with someone. Not being in love, just growing old. She said it like she didn't expect an answer. I gave her one anyway. Said I used to think about it all the time, until I got used to silence, till I learned how to arrange a life that didn't expect anyone else to enter it. She turned her head slightly at that, watching me from the corner of her eye. Then she asked, softly, almost a whisper, what I missed the most. I didn't need to think long. I told her I missed being known, not the first date. Kinda knowing, not the resume facts or fun facts or small talk. I meant the deep kind. The knowing that lives in shared routines and side glances. The knowing that lets someone hand you a cup of tea without asking how you take it. That kind of knowing. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she reached out and touched my hand. Fingers were cold but steady. She said she missed being missed. That night I didn't leave right away. She asked me to stay for dinner, and I did. We didn't cook anything complicated, just reheated soup from the fridge, bread warmed in the oven, cheese sliced into uneven triangles. We sat across from each other at the table like we had a dozen times before, but the air was different. Now, heavier. Or maybe just more honest. After dinner, she pulled out an old deck of cards from a drawer and asked if I played rummy. I told her I hadn't in years. She dealt the cards anyway. We played for hours, the rhythm of shuffling and stacking, filling the silence between thoughts we were still too cautious to say aloud. We laughed once or twice, soft, real, fleeting. And when I got up to leave, she didn't walk me to the door. This time, instead, she just stood in the middle of the living room and looked at me like she wasn't sure what she wanted to say. I told her I'd be back tomorrow. Not for any reason, just to check in. She nodded, smiled again, and whispered thank you. I left with that thank you echoing behind me, and something shifted after that night. We didn't name it, we didn't declare anything. But from that moment on, I stopped pretending I was just someone doing favors. I started showing up with less excuse and more intention. I brought over a new set of paints for her studio one morning. Another day I fixed the loose tile by her front step without being asked. On a Tuesday, I left a loaf of bread and a handwritten note on her porch when she was out in her signature, but she knew it was from me, and she changed to, she left the porch light on again, started wearing earrings, hung a wind chime near the back door. One morning I caught her humming while watering the daisies that had managed to bloom again despite the cold. She didn't even realize she was doing it that week. She asked if I wanted to help decorate for the holidays. Said she hadn't unpacked the old ornaments in years, but thought maybe this year called for something different. We spent that Saturday untangling lights, dusting off figurines, hanging old memories on fresh hooks. She showed me a ceramic angel Patrick had given her the year they got married. Said she hadn't been able to look at it for a long time, but now it didn't hurt as much. Now she could place it near the window and feel something closer to warmth than grief. We stood back and admired the tree, slightly crooked lights uneven, but full of something raw and real. Something unpracticed but beautiful. She turned to me then, her eyes catching the light, and said, "It doesn't feel empty anymore." I didn't ask what it meant. Her voice, her face, the way she looked at me, that told me everything. Days between Thanksgiving and Christmas passed in a kind of gentle rhythm. I would stop by Elaine's house every few days, sometimes under the pretense of checking the roof for snow weight or tightening loose siding, other times with no excuse at all. She had stopped pretending to need reasons for me to be there. I had stopped pretending I didn't want to be. It was strange how quickly we'd settled into something that wasn't love in the traditional sense yet, but had all the makings of it. There was ease, laughter, and the sort of companionship that comes only when two people decide, quietly and without ceremony, that they are safe around each other. One afternoon, as the first soft snowfall of December began to blur the edges of the world in white, I found myself walking through her garden again, just as I had that first day with the gutters. The swing creaked under the weight of snow. The bird feeder we'd hung together was empty but still swayed from the wind. Inside the house, lights glowed warmly behind the curtains, and the scent of cinnamon and clove drifted through the air. Pulled from the chimney like a memory, Elaine opened the door before I could knock. She smiled, not the polite kind, not the guarded one either, but a full, open smile that reached her eyes and tugged gently at something inside me. She had flour on her apron and a smudge of dough on her wrist. Said she'd been baking all morning and the kitchen was a mess. I stepped inside and saw what she meant. There were trays of cookies on the counter, bowls stacked in the sink, a half-frosted cake on the table, and holiday music playing softly from the little speaker she kept near the window. She offered me a spoonful of frosting, holding it out like a peace offering or a dare. I tasted it and laughed. It was too sweet, a little gritty, and she rolled her eyes like she already knew it wasn't her best work. I told her it was perfect anyway. She said I was a terrible liar. I shrugged and said I preferred the word generous. After we cleaned up the kitchen together, she made cocoa and lit a few candles. We sat on the couch again, her legs curled under her, the blanket between us not quite hiding the growing electricity. In the room, the television was on, muted, playing some black and white Christmas film neither of us were watching. Instead, we talked. About the holidays, about traditions, about the versions of ourselves we used to be and the pieces we'd kept. That's when she told me about her late husband's last Christmas. She didn't speak with bitterness or tears, just memory. He had been sick by then, fading quietly. They had known it would be their last holiday together. She had cooked his favorite meal, played his favorite records, danced with him in the living room with the lights turned low and the tree glowing behind them. She said he'd smiled that night not out of joy, but out of love, a love that accepted endings, a love that knew goodbye was coming and kissed it anyway. She looked at me then and asked if I thought we only get one great love in a lifetime. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked around her home, met the framed photos, the flickering candles, the sweater draped over the chair, the second mug on the table. I told her I thought we were capable of more than one kind of love, that sometimes love comes again, quieter this time, without fanfare, but deeper. That maybe the second kind is the one that truly lasts, because it knows what can be lost. She didn't respond, not in words. But she reached out and touched my arm, her hand resting there for a long moment. I could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips, and I wondered if she could feel mine answering. The next day she called with a different kind of invitation. Not a lunch or a favor. She asked if I'd come with her to a holiday gathering at her friend Ruth's place. Said it was just a few people, mostly other women from her church group, and she didn't want to go alone. Said she didn't need me to pretend to be anything I wasn't, just that it would mean something to her if I came. I agreed, of course, without hesitation. But as soon as I hung up the phone, I sat there in silence, realizing the weight of what she'd just asked. This wasn't about gutters or garden swings or shared cups of tea. This was her asking me to be seen beside her, to be introduced, to be noticed, and maybe even to be speculated about. The gathering was that Saturday evening. I dressed a little better than usual, nothing fancy, just a nice button-up and a clean jacket. I brought a bottle of wine because it felt appropriate, and I arrived at her house just as she was stepping into the hallway mirror to fix her earrings. She looked radiant. Not because of makeup or effort, but because of ease. Because she looked like herself, fully and unapologetically. The drive to Ruth's was quiet at first. Then she asked if I was nervous. I laughed and said only a little. She said she was too. The house was already full when we arrived, soft chatter, clinking glasses, holiday music playing somewhere in the background. Ruth greeted us with a wide smile and a warm hug, and then the introductions began. And just like that, I was no longer just the guy who helps Elaine with things. I was Roman. I was her friend. I was the one she invited to come with her. The evening passed in a blur of conversations and tiny plates of food. I spoke to kind older women with sharp eyes and good instincts. I fielded questions, some subtle, some bold, about how I knew Elaine, how long I'd been helping her, what I did for work, and where I saw myself in the next few years. There was no malice in it, just curiosity wrapped in kindness. Honestly. And every time Elaine's hand brushed mine, or her eyes met mine across the room, something inside me settled deeper into place. Later that night on the drive home, she said thank you. Not for coming, but for being exactly who I was. She said it felt good to be seen again, not just as someone who had lost, but as someone who was still here, still hoping, still alive. We pulled into her driveway, and sat there for a moment in the quiet. The snow had begun again, soft and slow, like the sky was whispering. She turned to me and said, "You know, they all liked you," smiled and said, I was relieved. She looked at me, her face half in shadow, and asked, "Would it scare you if I said I don't feel alone anymore?" I shook my head. "Not at all," said, and neither of us moved to get out of the car, the morning after the gathering at Ruth's. The world outside Elaine's house had been transformed by a thick, hushed snowfall that blanketed everything. In clean, untouched white, the fences, rooftops, and dormant gardens all looked new, almost forgotten under the weight of it. I stood by my truck longer than I meant to, brushing the snow from the windshield, my thoughts still replaying the quiet moment from last night when neither of us moved to leave the car. The air inside had been thick with something more than warmth, something closer to unspoken permission. The kind of stillness that only exists between two people standing at the edge of something real. Elaine hadn't called that morning, wrote, and I hadn't planned to go over. But by late afternoon, I found myself driving there anyway, this time without any toolkit, in the back seat, without a reason except that I didn't want the day to pass without seeing her. The porch light was already on, glowing like a lighthouse through the curtain of falling snow. I knocked gently. She opened the door slowly, wrapped in that same gray cardigan she wore often, her hair pulled into, a loose braid that fell over her shoulder. She didn't look surprised to see me. There was something in her eyes that suggested she'd been waiting. Without a word, she stepped aside, letting me in. I followed her into the kitchen where the kettle had just begun to whistle. The kitchen was warm, smelled faintly of rosemary and orange peel. She motioned for me to sit, poured 2 mugs, and brought one to the table. We sipped in silence for a few minutes, and then she said something I hadn't expected. She told me she'd been dreaming again. Not the kind of dreams you remembered with clarity, but the kind that left an echo when you woke an ache in your ribs. A feeling in your chest you couldn't name. She said they started a few weeks ago, around the time we put up the tree. That in these dreams, the house was always full of people, music, and light, and I was there, not as a visitor, not as someone fixing something. I was just there, present. Part of the scene, part of her life. She said it felt like her heart had picked up a habit again, something it had given up on years ago. I set my mug down, unsure how to respond. But she didn't need a response. She just looked at me across the table with that same calm, unwavering gaze that had made me nervous the first few times we met. Not because it was cold, but because it saw too much. And I think in that moment, she saw something in me I hadn't fully admitted yet. She stood, walked to the living room, and returned with a small photo album in her hands. She sat beside me, flipped it open, and slowly began turning the pages. Images of holidays past. Patrick standing beside her with a snow shovel and a crooked grin. Her as a younger woman, laughing in front of a fireplace with 2 friends whose names I didn't catch. Decorations, dinners, candles flickering on windowsills. A life once lived in full color. She paused on a photo of herself holding a snow globe, the kind with a miniature house and glittering flakes inside. She said Patrick had given her that globe the year they found out he was sick. Said he called it a memory in a bottle and told her to shake it whenever the world felt too still. I asked if she still had it. She nodded and left the room briefly, returning with the globe in her hands. She set it down gently on the table, gave it a soft shake, and we watched the snow swirl inside together. The house inside it looked so peaceful, so still, yet filled with a kind of magic. She said it used to make her cry. Now, it just made her think. She turned to me then and asked if I'd ever considered starting over. Not starting fresh, there was a difference. Fresh meant forgetting. Starting over meant building again, but with all the pieces you'd carried. This far, I said, I thought about it more and more lately. She smiled faintly, then changed the subject as if she had opened the door to something and now wanted to see if I'd walk through it. Myself. We spent the rest of the evening side by side, on the couch. Each of us lost in thought. The snow globe resting on the table like a quiet reminder that time, though slowed, was still moving. The next few days brought more snow, more cold, and more visits that neither of us labeled. I'd stop by after work, sometimes bringing soup or fresh bread, sometimes just my guitar or the books she'd mentioned. She'd have candles lit, music playing low, and that same patient openness in her presence that made me feel like I could breathe a little deeper around her. And then came the moment that would shift everything. It was a Sunday, late afternoon. The sky had already turned to a soft bruised gray, and she'd invited me to help bring some boxes down from the attic ones filled with old winter decorations she wanted to sort through. We climbed the narrow stairs, ducked under a beam, and began passing boxes back and forth. Some were labeled with old marker. XMAS lights, candle holders, Patrick stuff. As she opened one of the boxes, a small envelope fell out. She paused, picked it up, and stared at it. I asked if she was okay. She nodded slowly, then opened it and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a letter. She said it was one Patrick had written in the last weeks of his life, something she hadn't read since the year after he passed. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it, eyes scanning the page. Then she handed it to me without saying a word. I hesitated before reading, but she nodded gently. It was short, honest, beautiful. A letter to her future self, telling her that it was okay to move on. Love wasn't bound to one person forever. That if someone came along who made her laugh again, who helped her feel known again, she should let them in, that it wouldn't be betrayal, it would be life continuing in the way it was meant to. When I looked up, there were tears in her eyes. Not grief. Not pain, just release. She said she didn't know why she found it now, why this moment. But maybe it was timing. Maybe it was something more. Then she said it without ceremony, without a nervous laugh or a disclaimer. She looked at me, her voice soft but steady, and asked, "Would you ever marry a 49-year-old widow?" I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to be sure she saw the answer in my eyes before she ever heard it from my mouth. There was a moment of absolute stillness in the attic after she asked me that question. Not the kind of stillness that begs to be filled with nervous laughter or hasty explanations, no. This one was deeper, the kind that settles in the bones and asks you to sit with it for a while. The dust floating in the narrow beam of light from the small attic window seemed to freeze midair, and even the house beneath us, usually creaking in protest to the cold, felt quiet, like it too was waiting for what would come next. Elaine hadn't said it with a tremble. There was no hesitation in her voice, no false lightness or coyness in her tone. She wasn't joking. She wasn't asking for fantasy or flattery. She was asking me, with the steadiness of a woman who had lost and lived, and learned what kind of question really matters in the end. She wasn't asking if I loved her. She wasn't asking for promises of happily ever after. She was asking, would I take her life, her age, her grief, her story, and still say yes? I looked at her, really looked, and saw all of it in her face. The strength it took to say those words out loud. The vulnerability she rarely showed. The tiny flicker of fear beneath her calm. The part of her that had been alone for years, that had slowly learned how to open the windows again, and had now flung the door wide open, not knowing if anyone would walk through. And in that moment, something inside me softened and anchored. All at once I told her I didn't care how old she was. I told her I saw her, not her years, not her widowhood, not the past that had shaped her, but her. The woman who baked bread that sometimes flopped, but always made the house smell like warmth. The woman who kept a broken porch swing because it creaked with memory. The woman who laughed quietly but fully, who hummed when she thought no one was listening, who still cried when she read old letters but didn't hide from the tears. I said I couldn't answer her question with a yes or no, because that would cheapen it. Instead, I said I wasn't walking away. That if she was asking whether I could see a life that included her, whatever that meant, however it looked, then yes. I was already living that life. Her eyes filled then, and she looked away quickly. Blinking too fast, stepped forward, gently took the letter from the table, and returned it to its envelope. We stood in silence for a while, and then she reached out and rested her hand on my chest, over my heart, and whispered I needed to know I wasn't alone in this anymore. That night, we didn't talk about it again, not in words. We went downstairs, ate soup she had made earlier in the day, and watched the snow fall in silence. But something had changed. There was no going back to how it was before. Her question lingered not as an unresolved tension, but as an open invitation to bridge between us we both knew we would eventually cross. Over the next few days, life settled, back into a familiar rhythm, but beneath that rhythm pulsed something new. We moved slower, more deliberately. She touched my arm more when passing by. I stayed longer after dinner. One evening, I found her sitting on the couch with her knees, drawn up, reading a book of poetry. She looked up and asked if I wanted to hear one. I nodded, and she read aloud, her voice soft, almost hesitant. The poem was about time, not the ticking kind, but the kind that lives in the folds of routine and quiet moments. It spoke of how love can be loud when it's young, but quieter, steadier. As it matures, when she finished, she looked at me and said, "That's what this feels like to me. It's like something that doesn't need to shout to be real." I agreed, and in that quiet agreement, another thread wove itself between us. One afternoon, I brought over my guitar. She hadn't known I played, and when I told her it had been years since I'd picked it up, she insisted I try. I sat on her porch and strummed through a few old songs, my fingers rusty, but the melody still tucked away in my hand somewhere. She sat in the doorway, eyes closed, rocking slightly. After a while, she began to hum along, then sing softly at first. Then with more confidence, her voice was low and rich, the kind that wrapped around the lyrics like a second skin. When we finished, we sat in silence for a long time, the last chord still vibrating faintly in the wood of the guitar. Then, she said something unexpected. "You think," she asked, "that people can fall in love more than once with the same person?" I looked at her, confused. She explained, "I feel like I'm falling for you now in a way I didn't allow myself to before. Not out of surprise, not even out of longing, but out of recognition. It's like I already know the shape of you in my life, and I'm just letting myself see it." Clearly now, it wasn't a declaration. It was a confession. And with it, the air between us shifted again. I told her that falling didn't have to mean tumbling. It could mean leaning, resting, choosing, over and over again without fanfare. And that, yes, I felt the same. That this, whatever it was, felt more real than anything I'd stumbled into in years. From then on, our days took on a different kind of weight. Not heavier, just more deliberate. We planned small things together, a new paint color for her bedroom, a walk down the trail behind her house, a pie recipe she wanted to try. And though we still hadn't spoken again about the question she'd asked, it was no longer hanging in the air as something unanswered.
Oh.
It was there, like a seed, planted, growing quietly in the space between us. We spent Christmas together. She invited me without pretense. I brought over breakfast in the morning, cinnamon rolls, slightly burned on the edges, and she laughed when I told her I got distracted watching the driveway from my kitchen window. For me, without me knowing, we made a roast together, and when the day ended, we sat by the fireplace with 2 glasses of wine. Watching the flames dance and fade, she leaned her head on my shoulder. I rested my hand over hers, and in that moment, with no music playing, no words spoken, no questions asked, I realized something. She hadn't needed a proposal. She needed someone who stayed. The days after, Christmas melted into each other, like snowflakes on a warm palm, gentle, brief, and strangely significant. There was no declaration that things had changed between us, but everything had. The language of how we moved around each other began to shift. I started to reach for her hand without thinking. She began setting out 2 mugs without asking if I'd stay. We moved as though the house itself had started to recognize our rhythm, reshaping the quiet into something shared rather than solitary. Elaine's world had always been careful. Her movements, her expressions, her invitations, they had all been framed with a kind of respectful caution. And now, that care didn't disappear, but it softened, began laughing more openly, touching my arm mid-sentence, as if to anchor me there.
Us.
Sitting closer when we watched movies on the couch. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't performative. It was just the sound of doors creaking open from the inside. She called me one morning to tell me. The pipes under her kitchen sink were acting up again. I offered to come that afternoon, and when I arrived, I found her sitting on the floor of the kitchen with a flashlight, her sleeves rolled up and a wrench in her hand. She looked up and smiled like she'd been waiting for me to walk in all day. I took over the job, and she watched, handing me tools I didn't ask for, like it was our little version of a dance. When I finished, she wiped her hands on a towel and offered to make lunch. We sat in her breakfast nook, the windows fogged from the warmth inside clashing with the bitter cold outside, and ate grilled cheese with tomato soup. She said she hadn't made that meal in years, said it used to be Patrick's favorite on snowy days, and she'd been avoiding it since he passed. I asked her why she made it now. She shrugged, then said something that stuck with me, because today didn't feel like a memory. It felt like something new. There was an intimacy growing in the small details, how I knew where she kept the extra paper towels now, how she no longer turned on the porch light out of habit when I left, because we both knew I wouldn't leave until the night felt finished, and sometimes not even then. I began keeping a toothbrush in her bathroom. She began leaving notes on the fridge reminders to pick up eggs, or a scribbled line from a poem she'd liked. One evening, we were sorting through a box of books in her attiquines she had been meaning to donate but hadn't touched in years. We took turns reading the back covers, flipping through dog-eared pages, pausing over dedications. She came across one that had a receipt folded inside from a cafe in Maine. It's dated 2007. It wasn't significant in any obvious way, but she stared at it for a while before saying it was from the last road trip she and Patrick had taken. I asked her if she ever thought about leaving this town, if she'd ever want to start fresh somewhere else. She looked at me, considering the question with that same deliberateness she gave to everything that mattered. Then she said, "I used to think I'd have to leave this place to move on. Now I think moving on just means letting life happen again, Evan." Here, I understood what she meant. We both carried ghost snot, the haunting kind, but the kind that lived gently in the corners, whispering reminders of who we were and who we loved. Neither of us needed to erase the past. We just didn't want to be trapped in it anymore. In the first week of January, I came over on a night when the snow was coming down in thick sheets. Power flickered once, then went out entirely. Elaine lit candles without panic, like it had happened before, and she knew exactly what to do. We sat on the floor of her living room, wrapped in quilts, sipping red wine by the firelight and telling stories from years we didn't know each other. She told me about her first apartment, how the wallpaper peeled no matter how often she pressed it back. I told her about the dog I had as a kid that used to hide his toys in my shoes. When the power came back an hour later, both blinked it. The brightness then left the lights off anyway. That night, I didn't leave. It wasn't a moment filled with passion or some cinematic crescendo. It was simpler than that. She went upstairs to change into pajamas and came back down with an extra blanket. She handed it to me without speaking, then curled up on the couch beside me. I covered us both, and we fell asleep to the sound of the wind outside, the flicker of the fireplace still casting shadows across the room. From that night on, there was no unspoken agreement or awkward redefining of roles.
We didn't talk about
What this meant? We didn't need to. We were already in it, living it, and yet every now and then, she would say something that reminded me how brave she was for trying again. One morning, as I helped her shovel the front walkway, she looked at me and said, "Sometimes I still worry that I'm reaching for something that isn't mine to keep." I paused, resting on the handle of the shovel, and told her gently, "Then we'll just keep holding it together." Her eyes shimmered not from the cold and she nodded. Elaine began inviting me to more parts of her life. I met her sister during a video call. I helped her repaint the spare room, which she said she might turn into a reading nook, even though we both knew it might become something else. She came with me to a hardware store once and teased me for how long I took in the screw aisle. She listened to my rants about clients and repairs and rising prices and nodded like it mattered just as much as her garden did to her, and through it all, I noticed how the house began to shift, as if making space for us. There was an extra pair of gloves on the entry bench. A framed picture of us taken by Ruth at her holiday gathering appeared on a shelf in the hallway. The fridge magnets slowly rearranged themselves into a collage of our shared routines, lists, photos, scribbled jokes. The attic once a place for forgotten memories, became a space for sorting what to keep and what to let go. We hadn't answered her question in any official way. There were no rings, no proposals, no timelines. But every time I showed up without being asked, every time she reached for my hand while stirring something on the stove, every time we sat in silence and still felt full, the question had its answer: love. We were learning. Wasn't something you asked for, it was something you lived into. And we were doing exactly that, day by day, gesture by gesture, letting our hearts inch forward through the snow, through the quiet, through all. The years behind us and all the years ahead, the new year had settled into its quietest rhythm. Snowfall softened into morning mist, and the sharpness of the cold began to fade into something gentler, though winter still held the trees bare and the air brittle. Elaine and I had found our flow, not marked by declarations or labels, but by the way our days bent toward each other naturally. Some mornings, I'd arrive before she even made coffee, and we'd move through the day without speaking much, me fixing small things around the house, or tending to her bookshelves or plants, both of us content in that quiet understanding. Only time and trust can build. But just when life begins to feel predictable, it finds a way to tilt. It was a Wednesday when the letter arrived. I found it sitting on the small wooden table near Elaine's entryway, unopened. Addressed in tidy handwriting that made my stomach tighten before I even read the return address. She noticed the shift in my posture as I picked it up, and I asked if she wanted me to leave. She took the envelope from my hand and shook her head, her thumb brushing the paper once before she opened it with slow precision. It was from Mark, her stepson, Patrick's son from a previous marriage. She hadn't seen him in nearly 5 years. They'd exchanged a few holiday cards after the funeral, maybe the occasional birthday message, but distance had turned to silence over time. According to the letter, he was planning to visit. Short trip, he wanted to see how she was doing and introduce her to his fiancée, Lily. They'd be in town that weekend. Elaine didn't say much after reading it. She folded the letter carefully and set it on the kitchen counter. I asked if she was okay. She said she didn't know yet. The next few days stirred something in her. She moved a little more briskly around the house, organizing shelves that didn't need organizing, wiping counters that were already clean. I could see the old rhythms returning, ones driven by anxiety, not habit. Her voice was polite, warm even, but there was a tightness at the edge of her sentences. I didn't press, stayed nearby, helped with the errands she created for herself, and waited for her to invite me into whatever she was feeling. On Friday evening, she finally did. We sat on the back porch, bundled in coats, watching our breath cloud in the air like smoke. She said she didn't know how to explain me to Mark, that he'd always been protective of her, had strong opinions about what moving on should look like, and more importantly, when it should happen. She worried he might see our relationship as disrespectful to Patrick's memory, or worse, opportunistic. And though she wasn't ashamed of what we had, she didn't want to feel like she was justifying love to someone who hadn't walked her path. I told her we didn't need to define anything for anyone else, that we weren't building this relationship for approval or permission. But I also said I understood that history had layers, and some people only saw the surface. She looked at me, then really looked in, said, "I'm not hiding you. Just don't want what we've built to be misunderstood before it's even seen." On Saturday, Mark arrived. He was taller than I expected, with sharp features that reminded me of old pictures Elaine had once shown me of Patrick in his 20s. Lily was warm and gracious, with an open smile and curious eyes that scanned the home like it held pieces of stories she hadn't yet heard. Elaine greeted them with a steadiness I admired, her voice smooth, her movements calm. She introduced me simply. "This is Ben. He's been helping with the house." That night, she made dinner for the 4 of us. A quiet tension threaded through, the meal not hostile, but cautious. Mark asked questions about the neighborhood, about how the winters had been, about whether Elaine was keeping up with the roof repairs. He glanced at me a few times, but said little in my direction. Lily, however, asked me about my work, about how I'd met Elaine, about what I loved about the town. She didn't ask questions like an investigator. She asked them like someone who genuinely wanted to know. Later, After the dishes were cleared, and everyone had settled into softer conversation, Mark brought up Patrick. He told a story about a fishing trip they'd taken years ago, one that ended with a flat tire and an overnight stay in a sketchy roadside motel. Elaine laughed, and I could see in her eyes how grateful she was for that memory. Then Mark said, "It's strange. You know, seeing this place without him. It's like the walls are familiar, but the air feels different." Elaine nodded. "Everything feels different, but that doesn't mean it's worse." The room went quiet again, but not uncomfortably so. Mark looked at her, then at me, and asked directly, "So are you, together?" It wasn't an attack. It was a question wrapped in confusion and concern. Elaine didn't hesitate. "We are. In our own time, in our own way." Mark looked at me, and for a long second I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Judgment, maybe, but also curiosity. Then he nodded slowly and said, "As long as you're okay, that's all I care about." The rest of the weekend passed with less strain. On Sunday morning, Lily pulled me aside as we were loading the trunk of their rental car and said, "He'll come around. It's just hard for him to see something new where there used to be something sacred. But I can tell. You're not trying to replace anyone, just trying to show up." That sentence stayed with me. After they left, Elaine and I sat on the couch, both of us exhausted in that quiet, emotional way that follows family visits. She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder, and said, "I didn't know if I was ready for that, but maybe no one ever really is." I told her she handled it perfectly. She didn't owe anyone an explanation, but the one she gave had been honest. And she smiled, tired, relieved, and said, "I just wanted to protect this. Whatever we're growing, I don't want anyone to name it before we do." That night, as the snow started again and the house fell into its usual hush, I looked at the space around us and realized it truly was our space now. Not defined by declarations or defended by arguments, but shaped by mutual care, chosen presence, and the courage to be seen in the light of someone else's memory. Love in that house had not replaced what came before. It had simply found room. Beside it, the snow didn't stop for days after Mark and Lily left. It fell in soft, steady sheets that blanketed the town in a kind of hushed reverence, as if winter itself were asking the world to slow down and listen. Elaine and I fell back into our rhythm almost instinctively. The visit had stirred something. Yes, but not in a way that threatened what we had. If anything, it reaffirmed it. That weekend had placed our relationship into the context of other people's eyes, and somehow we emerged more certain of what it was. Even if we still refused to name it with anything definitive, there was a quiet confidence in the way we moved through the days after. Elaine didn't bring up the letter again, and neither did I. Instead, we found ourselves more open in small ways. She began reading aloud to me from whatever book she had nearby, sometimes poems, sometimes old journals she rediscovered while cleaning out closets. I began leaving small things behind intentionally. A flannel shirt in her laundry room, a half-used notebook on her coffee table, a hammer in the hallway closet. There was no conversation about it. It was just understood. My presence was no longer temporary. One morning, as I was pouring coffee in her kitchen, she came in still wrapped in the shawl she'd kept from the night before, hair a little messy, eyes barely awake, and she just looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You've made this house feel like it's breathing again." I didn't respond right away. There was nothing to say that wouldn't cheapen it, so I walked over, kissed the top of her head, and whispered that I wasn't going anywhere. That became our quiet promise, one never written down, never spoken too loudly. We didn't talk about forever. We didn't make lists of what next year might look like. But in everything we did, there was an unspoken agreement that we were building something, not just passing time. Every dinner we cooked together, every errand run in silence, every storm watched from the porch. These were bricks in the foundation of something real. Elaine began to share more about Patrick in ways that felt new, not as a test or a comparison, but as a bridge. She told me about the way he used to overwater her plants until they wilted with love, about the way he'd leave notes inside her cookbooks, scribbled on index cards with phrases like "add more nutmeg" or don't forget to dance while it simmers. She pulled out an old tin box one night that was filled with those notes, dozens of them, folded neatly, fragile at the edges. We read them together by candlelight, smiling not because they were sad, but because they were so filled with life. It was clear that Patrick hadn't just been her husband. He had been her partner in the kind of daily magic that makes a life together feel meaningful. And what moved me most wasn't her grief, it was the way she had left room in her heart to feel joy again, even if it came shaped differently now. One day, while we were walking through a small antique shop in town, Elaine paused at an old wooden cabinet, its paint chipped, one hinge loose. She ran her hand along the edge and said, "This would look nice in the hallway near the stairs, don't you think?" I nodded, but it wasn't the cabinet I was looking at. It was the fact that she'd said the hallway, not my hallway. A tiny shift in language, tiny confirmation of what we already knew but had never had to say. We bought the cabinet. It wobbled a little on one leg, but we both agreed that gave it character. The following weekend, we tackled the hallway, rearranged frames, repainted the baseboards, moved a small bench under the window where she could sit and read in the mornings. It was the kind of project that could have taken hours but took the whole day, because we kept pausing to tell stories or get distracted by music or step outside to feel the sun on our faces. At one point, she stood in the doorway with a paintbrush in her hand and said, "I like this version of my life. It feels less like I'm surviving and more like I'm composing." There was something poetic about the way she phrased it, and I told her so. She smiled and returned to painting the trim. I couldn't stop thinking about how people often chase extraordinary moments to define their relationships. But maybe the most extraordinary thing was how we'd made even painting trim feel sacred. One evening, as the sky turned to lavender and the house grew still around us, Elaine asked me a question different than the one she'd asked all those weeks ago, but rooted in the same quiet vulnerability. "What do you think a future between us would actually look like?" I took a long breath before answering. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to answer with anything but truth. I told her it wouldn't be perfect. There'd be days we annoyed each other, days the world got too loud or too fast. But I also said I imagined a future where we woke up most mornings not because of alarm clocks, but because of the comfort of knowing someone else was there. A future where we still made soup on snowy nights and laughed about how bad we were at folding fitted sheets, where we walked slower in spring because we didn't need to rush anymore, where love didn't have to be young or loud to be full. Elaine was quiet for a long time after that. Not the heavy kind of quiet, more like she was holding something, fragile and precious in her thoughts. Then she reached for my hand, held it between both of hers, and said, "I think I could live that life." That night, we danced in the living room. No music, no reason, just a slow swaying movement to the rhythm of our shared breath. She rested her head against my chest, and I kissed the top of her hair, thinking about how far we'd come from that first day on the ladder, wiping leaves from her gutters. We hadn't planned this. We hadn't even named it, but it was real, and it was ours. And maybe that was the only kind of certainty we needed. It started with a creaking floorboard. Not the kind that groans in protest under years of weight, but a sharper, splintering kind of sound that caught both of our attention one quiet morning. Elaine had been reaching for a coffee mug on the top shelf, while I leaned against the island reading the local paper. And when she stepped back, her heel pressed into the narrow edge of one board that had always been slightly loose. This time, it didn't just creak, cracked. We both paused and looked down. The sound wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to pull our gaze to the floor beneath our feet. She glanced at me and raised an eyebrow, half amused, half resigned. "I suppose that's the house's way of telling me something." I chuckled and knelt to inspect the damage. It wasn't severe, but the wood had splintered slightly, exposing a soft patch beneath. I tapped around the area, then straightened up and told her gently this might be a little more than a one-nail fix. We didn't do anything about it that day. The day after, yet something about that splintered floorboard shifted the energy in the house. It was like a subtle whisper, an invitation to tend to the deeper bones of the place we now both occupied. Over breakfast the next week, Elaine brought it up again, casually at first. She said she'd been thinking about renovating. It's not just the floorboard, but the entire kitchen. She'd been in that house for over 20 years, and while it held Memories in every corner. She was starting to realize some of those memories had grown stale. She looked at me thoughtfully, then asked, "Would that be strange? To change the heart of a home that's been the same for so long?" I told her no. That homes, like people, need permission to evolve. That there was nothing wrong with honoring the past, while shaping it into something that could hold the present more comfortably. She nodded, but didn't say much else. Still, I could see the idea had rooted itself in her mind. That afternoon, I caught her measuring the counters with a tape measure she'd borrowed from my truck. A few days later, we sat together at the small table near the window, sketching ideas on the back of a napkin like kids dreaming up their future treehouse. She wanted open shelves where the bulky cabinets used to hang. I suggested a wider sink, one deep enough for garden tools and baking trays alike. We talked about switching out the old linoleum floors for warm hardwood, maybe even painting the walls a softer shade than the tired beige that had clung to them. For decades, but somewhere between talk of backsplash tiles and light fixtures, I realized this wasn't just about the kitchen. Elaine was making space for something new. For us, this renovation wasn't a project, it was a gesture. A quiet, brave step toward permanence. It hit me harder than I expected. I found myself lingering in the hallway longer than usual, touching the walls like they were beginning to include me in their history. My boots found a home by the back door instead of just beside it. I started keeping a second toolbox in her garage, an act I hadn't even registered until I saw it tucked neatly beside her gardening supplies. This wasn't a weekend stop anymore. I was becoming part of the structure. Elaine noticed it too. One evening, as we stood in front of the stove trying to decide whether to cook or order out, she gently nudged my arm and said, "Do you ever think about what it would be like if this was yours too?" She didn't ask it with weight or pressure. It was just curiosity, spoken aloud. I didn't answer right away. I took my time, stirred the sauce on the stove, and looked around the chipped ceramic spoon rest. The calendar still turned to last. Month, the yellow notepad by the fridge with her looping cursive handwriting. It already felt like mine. But what surprised me was that it also felt like hers, and I didn't need to change that. I just wanted to be part of it. Eventually, I turned to her and said, "I think maybe it already is." She didn't cry. She didn't rush in with more questions. Just leaned in, rested her head against my shoulder, and whispered, "Okay." Started the renovation the following week. Not with hammers or contractors, but with clearing the cabinets. Elaine held up each item like it had a story, and many did. We made 3 piles: keep, donate, and goodbye. The goodbye pile was the hardest. It included things she hadn't used in years but couldn't let go of until now. It's an old blender that wheezed like it had emphysema, a cookie tin with a rusted latch, a stack of mismatched mugs from various state fairs she and Patrick used to visit. She turned to me with one of the mugs in hand and said, "Strange how letting go of things doesn't feel like betrayal anymore. It just feels like breathing again." I knew exactly what she meant. That night, the kitchen was half empty, and the walls echoed slightly when we walked through. It felt vulnerable, but it also felt new. Elaine stood in the middle of the room, arms crossed, eyes scanning the bare shelves, and smiled in a way that was both nostalgic and ready. "This place has held a lot of love," she said. "It's ready to hold more." It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a plan. It was something more honest. An opening. Later in bed, while the house settled around us and the cold wind tickled the windows, I reached for her hand in the dark. She laced her fingers with mine, no words needed. We were renovating a kitchen, but what we were really building was the rest of our lives. The first time we took the cabinet doors off, the sound echoed louder than expected through the kitchen, a sharp reminder that change was happening not just slowly, but loudly. Elaine stood back with her arms folded, watching me loosen the last hinge from the frame, a gentle smile playing on her lips, like she was seeing the house breathe for the first time in years. The walls looked bare without the upper cabinets, but in their emptiness, there was potential space for something new. Uncluttered by the weight of memory, we decided to do most of the work ourselves, at least the parts that didn't require professional wiring or plumbing. Elaine had insisted it wasn't about saving money. It was about doing it with her own hands. She said it felt more honest that way. I understood that. Every screw I drove, every tile we lifted, it all felt like we were rewiring something deeper than just a kitchen. But change, even the most well-intentioned kind, has a way of stirring dust from unexpected corners. Elaine got a call one afternoon while we were at the hardware store. I stood a few aisles over, comparing types of tile adhesive. When I saw her face shift under the bright fluorescence, her voice dropped low, polite but strained, and when she hung up, her fingers lingered on the phone screen a moment longer than necessary. I walked over and asked if everything was okay. She hesitated before answering, then told me it was her college friend, Diane, someone she hadn't seen in years, but had recently reconnected with through an alumni newsletter. Apparently, Diane was driving through town and had asked if she could stop by for coffee. Nothing dramatic, nothing to worry about. But the way Elaine said it told me there was more behind the visit than just catching up. We cleaned the house. That morning, not frantically, but with more attention than usual. Elaine adjusted throw pillows she normally didn't care about and opened windows that hadn't been unlatched all winter. I helped but stayed quiet, watching her carefully. When Diane arrived, I was already in the garage sanding an old side table we planned to repaint for the kitchen. Could hear the tone of their greetings through the walls, warm but cautious, curious. Eventually, Elaine called me inside to meet her. Diane was tall, stylish, in a casual, curated sort of way. Hair was pulled back into a neat bun, her scarf tied just right, her smile wide but appraising. When Elaine introduced me, I extended a hand and she shook it, firm but brief. "Ray!" Her eyes scanning me like she was mentally slotting me into a category she hadn't quite decided on yet. We made small talk, let them reminisce for a while, and only chimed in when addressed directly. Diane laughed often, and her voice carried through the room like she was used to commanding attention. There was a moment when she gestured to the half-finished kitchen and asked, with a playful grin, "So you've got a live-in handyman now?" Elaine smiled politely, saying only, "He's been a big help." I didn't take it personally, I bet. I also didn't miss the flicker in Elaine's eyes, the kind that appears when someone else tries to define your life in a way that feels too small. After Diane left, Elaine was quieter than usual. She sat on the edge of the porch with a cup of tea, staring out at the backyard like it held answers to questions she hadn't fully asked. I joined her without speaking, handing her a second blanket and sitting beside her, close but not crowding. Eventually, she said, she was always like that. Charming, clever, but always measuring. Even when we were in school, I used to admire it, but now it just feels like performance. I asked if Diane had said something that bothered her. She shook her head and replied no. But she reminded me of the version of myself I used to think I had to be. Perfectly poised, always smiling, never grieving too long, always moving on with grace. Then she looked at me, really looked, and said, "You've never asked me to be anything but real. You've let me be slow, quiet, messy." It was one of those moments that felt heavier than the words themselves. She wasn't just talking about Diane. She was talking about all the years in between. The spaces where she'd been performing grief or healing or strength for other people's comfort. And now in this chapter, she was finally allowed to exhale. That night, I stayed up late finishing the table in the garage. The sanding had smoothed out the scratches, but there were still faint scars in the wood, deep enough that they couldn't be erased completely, but shallow enough not to weaken it. I decided not to sand those out. They told a story, one worth preserving. When I brought it inside the next day, Elaine ran her fingers along the edge and smiled. "You left the marks." Nodded. "They give it character." She didn't respond right away, but I saw something soften in her. Maybe it was the way I'd seen her, or maybe it was the table, or both. Later that afternoon, she started taping up the walls to prepare for painting. I noticed she'd chosen a new color, not the warm ivory we'd discussed, but a soft, almost misty blue-gray. She looked at me and said, "I changed my mind. This feels calmer, more honest." We painted in silence for a while, the brushstrokes rhythmic and soothing. The color slowly replaced the tired beige inch by inch like a tide, moving in and gently reclaiming the shore. The room felt cooler, quieter. It felt like her. And maybe in some small way, like me too. We didn't talk about Diane again. We didn't need to. Her visit had served its purpose not as conflict, but as clarity. Elaine wasn't mourning friendship or wrestling with resentment. She was realizing that not every person from the past had to belong in the future. Some connections were chapters. Others were roots. And I was beginning to understand that I had become the latter. That evening, after the paint dried and the tools were put away, we sat on the floor of the kitchen, backs against the bare wall, legs stretched out and touching. She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "I used to be afraid that love after loss would feel like betrayal. But now I think the real betrayal would have been never letting myself feel this again." I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. I just reached for her hand and held it like it was the first and only thing that had ever made sense. We sat there until the room turned blue with twilight. Just two people in a house that was slowly becoming a home. By the end of the second week, the kitchen had started to resemble something new. The walls were fully painted, the floors had been sanded and sealed, and the light fixtures' soft brass sconces Elaine found at a local salvage shop cast a warm glow that felt like dusk, even in the morning. It still smelled faintly of sawdust and fresh paint, but the aroma wasn't harsh. It was comforting, like the scent of possibility. Shelves weren't up yet, and the new sink was still sitting in a box near the doorway, but the hardest parts were behind us. The space no longer looked like a renovation zone. It looked like a room waiting to welcome a future. Elaine stood in the middle of it one morning, barefoot on the new hardwood, arms crossed loosely as she surveyed the changes. She didn't say much, but her eyes darted from corner to corner, like she was trying to memorize the feeling. I watched her quietly, letting her take it in. After a moment, she turned to me and said, "Let's get out of the house today." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a suggestion. It was a decision, soft but firm. We didn't have a destination in mind. It's just a shared sense that the walls had held us long enough for now, and that perhaps the open sky would speak in ways the kitchen couldn't. I packed a small thermos of coffee while Elaine grabbed 2 thick scarves and a bag of almonds she kept for drives. We got in the truck and drove without aim, letting the road wind us toward whatever the day held. We ended up about 30 miles out, near a small trail that looped around a frozen lake. The sun hung low in the winter sky, bright but not warm, and the air was crisp in a way that made you inhale more deliberately. There were few people there, just a couple of bundled-up hikers and a family teaching their golden retriever to sit still for a group photo. Elaine laughed quietly at the dog's refusal to cooperate and muttered that she admired that kind of stubborn joy. The trail itself wasn't long, maybe a couple of miles, but we walked slowly, letting our feet crunch along the packed snow and our silence fill in the spaces between bird calls and the distant rustle of dry leaves. She reached for my hand early in the walk, slipping her fingers between mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. It no longer felt like a tentative gesture. It felt like something built over time, like a path worn by habit and intention. We stopped at a small wooden bench overlooking the lake, the surface of it glistening under a thin layer of frost. Elaine sat down with a small sigh and stared out over the expanse like it was a painting she wanted to step into. I poured us each some coffee from the thermos, the steam rising in gentle curls as I handed her the tin cup. She took a sip and smiled. "Still too strong," she said, half teasing. I smiled back. "You'll get used to it eventually." She didn't reply. Instead, she leaned her shoulder against mine and let the silence stretch between us. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything unspoken, the days spent sanding and painting, the nights spent reading old love notes, the way her hand had rested on my knee during the drive without needing a reason. It was a silence made of trust. After a few minutes, she spoke again, voice low and steady. "I used to think I had to do everything on my own, not because anyone told me to, but because I thought grief made you stronger by default. Like if you could carry it without falling, it proved something." I didn't interrupt, but what I've realized, she continued, is that grief doesn't teach you to carry more. It teaches you to see who's willing to carry some of it with you. I turned to her and found her eyes already on me, not searching, not testing, just seeing, fully, and in that moment, I knew something had shifted. Not dramatically, not like a thunderclap or a declaration, but like a needle on a compass, gently settling into place. We weren't just rebuilding her kitchen. We were building something neither of us had expected to find again, as we continued our walk. She began telling me about a road trip she once took with Patrick through the Appalachian Mountains. How they got lost on the second day and ended up in a town that didn't exist on any map. How they laughed for hours in a roadside diner because the jukebox kept skipping and playing the same Buddy Holly song. Her voice carried no sadness in that moment, only warmth, as if time had softened the sharp edges of memory and left only the glow. I asked her if she missed those kinds of adventures. She nodded and said, "But not in the way people think. I don't miss the specifics. I miss who I was in those moments. Free, light, open." I squeezed her hand gently and said, "You're still that woman." She looked at me, eyes glassy, then said, "No, I'm a different woman now. But maybe this version of me still gets to have lightness, too." That evening, we stopped at a diner on the way home, not the one from her story, but close enough in spirit. The waitress called everyone hun, and the coffee was just a notch above instant, but it was warm and full of conversation. Elaine laughed more than I'd seen her in days. Real laughter, not polite or nostalgic laughter from the gut, like something inside her had cracked open and let joy spill through. When we got back home, the house was dark and quiet. I carried the bag of leftovers to the kitchen while Elaine turned on a lamp near the entryway. The new walls, still bare of any art or shelves, glowed soft in the amber light. She stood in the doorway for a moment and said, "It's starting to feel like us," and it was. Not hers, not mine. Us. As we got ready for bed, she paused at the foot of the mattress and asked softly, "Do you think we're just borrowing this happiness?" I walked over, touched her cheek, and said, "No, I think we're earning it." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night, sleep came easily. The kind of sleep that doesn't ask questions. The kind that comes when your heart is finally home. It was a Thursday when Elaine's sister Margaret pulled up in a small silver sedan with a trunk full of mismatched baking trays and a bouquet of lilies tucked beneath one arm. Margaret had always been the more formal one, sharp in speech, polished in dress, and unwavering in her sense of structure. Where Elaine let life bend and breathe, Margaret straightened its edges. They hadn't always seen eye to eye, but there was love in their tether, a kind that stretched rather than snapped. In that morning, she stepped onto the porch with one raised brow and a purse that matched her shoes. I was finishing the final coat on the kitchen cabinet doors in the garage. When Elaine called out to say her sister had arrived, I wiped my hands, peeled off my gloves, and made my way inside. The two women were already in the kitchen, Margaret scanning the room like a realtor inspecting a property. Elaine watching her with a quiet kind of patience, the kind you use when, someone will get to the compliment eventually, even if it's buried in critique. Margaret turned to me and smiled in a way that was more polite than warm. "You must be Ben," she said, offering her hand. "I've heard things." I shook her hand and smiled. "Good things, I hope." She glanced at Elaine, who merely sipped her tea with a smirk. "Mixed," Margaret said lightly. "So far, I approve of your cabinet alignment." We laughed, all three of us. Just like that, the tension slipped from the room. Margaret set the lilies in a vase near the window and took a seat at the kitchen table, her eyes trailing the new floors, the fresh paint, the unfinished shelf brackets. She said, "This place looks ... different." Elaine nodded. "It feels different, too." Margaret was quiet a beat too long, and then she said, "It feels lighter, like it exhaled." I could tell the words surprised even her, but they were true. The old weight that used to hang in the air, grief, routine, silence, was gone. In its place was movement, warmth, laughter, caught in corners. Half-finished ideas waiting on notepads and coffee mugs, left exactly where someone might need them again in 10 minutes. It was lived in now. Not perfect, not staged, but alive. While the sisters caught up, I went back out to the garage to gather the final cabinet doors. now dried and ready to be reattached. As I carried them in one by one, caught bits of their conversation. Margaret asking about Elaine's plans, her days, how she spent her mornings now. And then, as I set the last door on the counter, I heard her ask, "So, are you too serious?" Elaine didn't answer immediately. I didn't expect her to. But eventually, she said, "It's not about serious. It's about steady. It's about real." That answer hung in the air longer than the question had. Margaret didn't press. Instead, she shifted the topic, asking about paint colors and where Elaine found the new sconces. But I knew the question had been heard, and so had the answer. Later that afternoon, Margaret offered to make a lemon tart, something their mother used to bake during spring. Elaine was hesitant at first, said she didn't have the right flour. But Margaret waved her off, said she'd brought her own. Apparently she always traveled with baking essentials just in case. I offered to help, but Margaret politely declined, saying she preferred a quiet kitchen and precise measurements. Elaine winked at me from across the room and mouthed, "Control freak." I chuckled and left them to it. As the tart baked, the house filled with a scent that didn't just smell good, it felt good. It's like memories wrapped in sugar and citrus. I stood in the doorway watching the two sisters move around each other, sometimes bumping elbows, sometimes laughing at the same old jokes, and I realized something. This wasn't just about acceptance. It was about integration. A guest in this story anymore? I was being woven in, gently, intentionally. That evening, after Margaret left with a Tupperware full of tart slices and promises to visit again sooner, this time, Elaine and I sat on the porch swing, her legs curled beneath her, my arm draped loosely over her shoulder. The stars were beginning to scatter across the sky, and the air had that early spring coolness that hinted at warm days ahead but refused to let go of winter completely. She leaned her head against me and said, "She never liked anyone I dated. Ever. Not even Patrick." I glanced down at her, surprised. "Really?" She nodded. She respected him, admired him even. But she always thought he was too... emotionally distant, too closed off. I let the silence fill that space for a while, then asked, "And me?" Elaine smiled and said, "She sees what I see." That might have been the simplest, most profound compliment I'd ever received. The next morning, we reattached. The final cabinet doors together. It was a slow process, more because we kept pausing to admire the work than because it was difficult. With each hinge secured, the kitchen looked more whole, not perfect, not new, but whole. The kind of whole that only comes from effort and time and intention. As I closed the last door and stepped back, Elaine leaned against the doorway and said, "Well, that's that." I looked at her paint-smeared sweatshirt, hair tied up messily, a small chip of sawdust clinging to her cheek, and replied, "Not quite." She tilted her head, questioning. I walked over, gently brushed the sawdust from her face, and said, "The room's ready. Now we have to fill it." She nodded slowly. "Understanding with what?" "With whatever comes next," I said. We stood there a while. The kitchen, once a relic of the past, now held echoes of laughter, whispered plans, old scars, and new beginnings. And in the center of it all stood Elaine, steadier, softer, stronger. Not because she had to be, but because she chose to be. And I knew then, with more clarity than ever, that I hadn't just stepped into her life to fix her gutters or patch her walls. I had walked into her home to build something with her, not around the memory of what was lost, but within the possibility of what could be found. The next few days passed in a soft rhythm. With the kitchen nearly finished and the house settling into its new skin, Elaine and I found ourselves in a strange but welcome lull. There were no more shelves to hang, no more paint to mix. The toolbox, which had lived on the floor for weeks, was finally closed and stored. Mornings became slower, evenings quieter. The work that had filled our hands for so long was done, and now we had to figure out what to do with them. It was like reaching the top of a staircase and pausing not because there was nowhere left to go, but because we had to catch our breath and decide which door to open next. Elaine had started rising. Earlier than usual, not out of necessity, but out of a quiet eagerness, like something in her chest was stirring with the season's change. I'd often find her in the sunroom, a cup of tea balanced on the armrest, the newspaper folded but unread.
House.
She didn't say much during those early hours, and I didn't press someone in silence and let them be whatever they need to be in that moment. One of those mornings, while we sat facing the trees, just beginning to budge, she said, "I got a letter from the Historical Society." I looked up, curious. She hadn't mentioned them in weeks. "They want me to come back," she continued, "not just as a volunteer this time. It's a board member." I blinked. "That's a big deal, isn't it?" She nodded slowly, eyes still on the treetops. "Want me to oversee the renovation of the old granary? Turn it into an educational center? Lecture space? Community archives?" It was the kind of project that once would have lit her up from the inside restoration, but something in her voice felt hesitant, not fearful. It's just unsure. I waited before speaking. "Do you want to do it?" Elaine was quiet for a long time, then she said, "I'm not sure." Later that afternoon, she drove into town to meet with one of the committee members. I stayed back, offering to fix the squeaky porch step that had groaned beneath our feet for weeks. It wasn't doubt in her ability or her passion. It was something else, something that felt like she wasn't sure how this new chapter, this project, would fit into the version of her life that was slowly unfolding with me. When she returned, she looked thoughtful, not shaken, just reflective. We ate lunch outside, the sun finally warm enough to make the breeze tolerable. I didn't ask her what they talked about. I didn't need to. She brought it up on her own. "They want me to start next month," she said. "It's a big commitment. Meetings, planning, fundraising." I nodded, letting her speak. "And I keep wondering," she continued, "what happens if I say yes, not just to the job, but to everything, to being that version of me again?" Didn't quite understand what she meant, but I stayed quiet, hoping she'd explain. "When Patrick died," she said slowly, "I folded myself into the smallest version of who I was. I trimmed the edges. I stopped saying yes to big things. I thought it made me safe, manageable, contained." She looked at me then, eyes searching. "And then you came along, and the edges started growing back. I started expanding again. And now, I wonder if I take this, will I lose what we have? Or will it make me more of who I need to be?" I reached across the table and took her hand. "Lane, you don't have to shrink to fit beside me. If this is something you want, I'll support you. I'm not here to hold you in place. I'm here to grow with you." She looked down, blinking a few times, then nodded. "I know. I just didn't expect to feel so afraid of wanting something again." That night, I found her in the sunroom again, this time sketching, just rough outlines of the granary, notes in the margins, ideas scrawled in quick loops. She was coming back to life in a different way, not because she needed to move on, but because she was choosing to move forward. We didn't talk much, but when she finally looked up, she said, "You know, the last time I designed something this big, Patrick and I were still newlyweds." I walked over, kissed the top of her head, and said, "Maybe you don't need to get back to her. Maybe you're building someone even better." The next morning, Elaine accepted the offer. She printed out the letter, signed it with a steady hand, and pinned the schedule on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. It was a small gesture, but it marked a turning point. She was stepping into a new role. I could see it in the way she moved, slightly more upright, eyes a little brighter, thoughts spinning faster. But instead of drifting away, she started, inviting me into the process. She asked my opinion on her layouts. She brought me to the granary to see the space. She made room for me in her excitement, and in doing so, reminded me that love isn't just about staying close during quiet moments. It's also about holding on during the stretch. Still, a part of me couldn't help but wonder where this all would lead. Would the schedule pull her farther away? Would her growing independence shift the foundation we'd laid? Would the U.S. we'd built still fit into the expanding blueprint of her life? But those were questions for another time. Now, we stood in the middle of the granary, the afternoon sun slanting through the broken windows, and she pointed to the far wall, describing where the shelves would go, how the tables would be arranged, how the space would hold stories not just of the past, but of people like her, like us, who had found new beginnings when they thought they were out of pages. And as she spoke, I realized something important. Elaine didn't need permission to grow. She needed support. She needed someone who would anchor her without weighing her down. And maybe, just maybe, I was becoming that person. The granary project took up more of Elaine's time than either of us anticipated. Between the town meetings, material sourcing, and grant proposal deadlines, her days stretched longer. Even her evenings were filled with floor plans, sketched notes, and sticky tabs covering library books that hadn't been opened in years. And yet, despite how much fuller her life had suddenly become, I never once felt pushed aside. If anything, I felt more included. The difference now was that I wasn't just a companion to her. I was a part of the architecture of her plans. I was there in the margins, in the decisions she shared over dinner, in the questions she asked while brushing her hair at night. This wasn't a story where one person stepped back to let the other shine. It was a story where two people leaned in, making room for light to fall on both. One evening, well past sundown, Elaine came into the living room with a tired kind of energy I recognized from the days when she used to run the Historical Society full-time. She dropped a stack of papers onto the coffee table and let herself sink beside me on the couch. Without words, she leaned her head on my chest, her arm finding its familiar place draped across my middle, wrapped her in silence and warmth, the kind that comes from simply being present. After a while, she murmured, "It feels like I've returned to a past life, but with a different heart." I didn't respond immediately. There was a weight to those words, not a burden, but depth. A quiet confession that she was still learning who she was, now that her grief no longer sat at the front of every decision. I could feel how tired she was, not just from the work, but from the effort of rebuilding her sense of self while trying to keep us tethered. "I love seeing you like this," I finally said, my voice just above a whisper, focused, energized, lit from the inside. She smiled faintly against my chest, eyes still closed. "And you don't feel like I've left you behind?" "Not once," I answered. "Because you keep bringing me with you." She reached up, brushed her fingers against the stubble on my jaw and said, "I didn't know it was possible to feel full and uncertain at the same time." "Maybe that's how you know it's real," I said. "When you can love something deeply and still feel a little scared of how much you might lose if you mess it up." She pulled away just enough to look at me, her eyes softer than I'd. "Ever seen them? Do you ever think about what it would look like if this were permanent?" I hesitated, not because I hadn't thought about it, but because the question came wrapped in vulnerability. It wasn't just curiosity, it was an invitation. "I do," I said finally. "Almost every day." She nodded, her face unreadable. For a second, and she whispered, "What does it look like to you?" I paused, not because I didn't know, but because the answer had become so simple, it almost startled me. "It looks like mornings where you hum while making tea," I said. "Evenings where we forget what we were supposed to cook and end up with toast and wine. It looks like broken porch steps we fixed together, and too many books on one shelf. Looks like us, just ... Continuing. Elaine closed her eyes again, and let out a slow breath, as if something inside her had just been gently unlocked. That night, for the first time since I had arrived at her house all those weeks ago, she didn't just fall asleep beside me, she curled around me in a way that felt like choosing, not settling, not needing. Choosing. The following weekend, we went to the farmer's market. It was her idea, said we needed fresh herbs for the new kitchen. Even though the garden wouldn't be ready for planting until next season, I didn't care what the reason was. I just liked the idea of seeing her among people again, blending her quiet strength with the world outside our little bubble. The market was small, nestled behind the library and surrounded by trees just beginning to bloom. The booths were familiar, faces nodding in recognition as we passed. Some people waved. A few stopped to ask Elaine about the granary. One elderly vendor named Mrs. Keating pulled me aside and whispered, "She's been smiling more these days." "That's your doing, isn't it?" Smiled, unsure of how to answer. Elaine overheard, of course. Later, as we walked back to the truck with our arms full of basil, lavender, and a jar of local honey, she nudged me and said, "You're getting a reputation for what? For being the man who brought spring early?" I laughed, brushing a leaf of basil against her arm. Not a bad title. That evening, we set up small planters on the windowsill. The kitchen, though technically finished, had suddenly found new life again, not in its fixtures, but in the rituals we started creating inside it. We labeled each pot with chalk, her handwriting curving gently across the tags. Basil, time, hope. The last one was mine, of course. She rolled her eyes. She didn't erase it. We made dinner together, simple grilled fish with lemon and herbs, and ate it barefoot, standing at the counter, swaying a little to music, playing low in the background. When we'd finished, she set her plate down, turned to me, and said, "I keep waiting for the catch." "What do you mean?" She shrugged, looking both amused and a little raw. "For the moment where the illusion breaks, where I wake up and remember I'm a widow, and that happiness doesn't look like this, that I shouldn't be starting over, that it's too late." I stepped closer and took her hand. "But you're not starting over," I said. "You're starting from here, and it's not too late. It's just right." She stared at me for a long moment, then leaned in slowly. The kiss that followed wasn't rushed or desperate. It was patient, grounding. It was filled with all the moments we hadn't needed to say anything at all. It didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like arriving. Later that night, we lay in bed, legs tangled, the window open to let the cool night air in. She traced lazy circles on my arm and asked, "Do you ever wonder if this would have happened if I hadn't hired you?" I thought about that for a second, then said, "No, because I think we would have found each other some other way. You would have bumped into me at the grocery store or handed me a book at the library. The universe isn't subtle when it wants. Two people to meet." She smiled, eyes half-lidded, and I'm glad the gutters were a mess. We laughed quietly in the kind of way that echoed years into the future, and just before she drifted off to sleep, she whispered something so faint, I almost missed it. "I think I'm ready to believe in forever again." I didn't respond. I just pulled her closer. Because sometimes the answer is not in words, it's in how tightly you hold someone. When they finally let go of the past, the following week began like the others' quiet mornings, the clink of mugs. On the kitchen counter, soft music playing from the radio while we prepared for our respective days. Elaine had her granary meetings. I had a few small repair jobs around the neighborhood, nothing that took me far or for long, just enough to keep my hands busy and my head clear. But by midweek, something shifted. Not in our routine, but in the stillness around it. There was an unexpected knock at the door around 11 in the morning when Elaine was out at the town council office. I opened it to find a man in his early 60s, tall, silver-haired, with sharp cheekbones and a pair of sunglasses tucked into the collar of his button-down. He looked at me for a moment, as if weighing what to say. "Is Elaine here?" he finally asked. I hesitated, not out of suspicion, but because there was something in his tone, something that suggested history. "She's not home at the moment." I said, "Can I help you?" He smiled politely, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm an old friend. We went to school together. Name's Thomas. I'm in town for a few days and thought I'd drop by." "This is still her house, right?" I nodded slowly. "It is." He glanced past me at the freshly painted walls, the new porch trim, the evidence of change everywhere. "The place looks different. She's been putting a lot of love into it," I said simply. Thomas nodded again. "Good to hear. Tell her I stopped by. I'll be at the Lakeside Inn if she wants." "To catch up?" He turned and walked away without another word. I watched his back disappear down the driveway, a strange discomfort prickling at my skin. Not jealousy. Not exactly, but awareness. The kind that comes when a ghost wears flesh again, even just for a moment. When Elaine returned later, I told her about the visit. Her face shifted, not in panic or alarm, but in something more subtle. Thoughtfulness. A pause before she set her keys down on the counter. "Thomas," she repeated. "Thomas Grant." "Didn't catch the last name," I said. Just said. "You were old friends." She nodded slowly. "We dated. It's a very long time ago. Before Patrick. For a lot of things." I waited. "He was one of those people who never really fit the mold of the town," she continued. "Left early. Made a life in the city. I hadn't seen him since college." "Do you want to see him now?" I asked. not out of fear, but from a place of genuine care. Elaine was quiet for a long moment. Maybe just to close something, or confirm something. I don't know. I didn't press. Some doors have to be opened by the person who shut them in the first place. 2 days later, she went to the Lakeside Inn. She didn't dress up, but she wore the earrings she usually reserved for special meetings, small silver loops Patrick had given her once back when life was still mapped in wedding anniversaries and weekend plans. I said nothing about them, but I noticed. Of course I did. She returned after sunset. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes carried weight. Not the kind that lingers forever, but the kind that comes from digging into buried things. She sat beside me on the porch, handed me a wrapped chocolate from her coat pocket, and leaned back with a sigh. It was like talking to an old song, she said. Familiar in tone, but the lyrics don't mean the same thing anymore. I looked at her, waiting. We caught up, laughed a little, talked about the people we used to be. But it wasn't. It wasn't anything more than that. We're completely different people now. There was no spark, just ... nostalgia. That's not nothing, I said gently. No, she agreed. But it's not love either. She paused, then reached for my hand. It made me realize something, though. How easy it is to romanticize the past when you haven't made peace with the present. But I have been. I really have. That night, the way she touched me was different. Not more intense, not more urgent, but more rooted. Like something inside. Her had finally planted itself in the now, after years of drifting toward what-ifs and mid-events. And for the first time since she'd asked me that impossible question on the ladder weeks ago, I felt her choosing me with her whole self, not just her heart, but her memory too. A few days later, we went walking by the lake near the edge of town. It was early spring still, but the water shimmered with promise. We found a bench near the shore and sat in easy silence. Watching the ducks chase ripples and the sun pull golden lines across the surface, Elaine turned to me after a long while and said, "You know what I was thinking?" "What?" "That you're the first man who didn't try to replace what I lost. You didn't compete with it. You just stood beside it." I swallowed against, the lump rising in my throat. "That's because you never asked to be rescued," she nodded. "No, I just needed to be seen." I took her hand and held it tight. There were no fireworks, no music swells. Just two people sitting beside water, letting the wind carry away the last of the things they no longer needed. And then she asked, "Would you still say yes?" "To what?" "That question I asked you? About marrying a 49-year-old widow?" Looked at her and smiled. "I didn't need the gutters to fall in love with you, but I'm glad they did, because yes, I would still say yes." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned in and kissed me like someone who finally understood that love wasn't in the grand gestures or dramatic timing. It was in the ordinary days. In hands held through change and the quiet agreements to stay, and as the sun dipped, lower behind the trees, and the lake turned to glass. I realized something with complete certainty. This wasn't just a new beginning. It was the middle of a story we'd both finally learned how to write together. The house, once a symbol of her grief, had become something else entirely by the end of that spring. The corners held laughter now, the walls painted and patched. Over time, bore stories only the two of us knew. There was a warmth in every room that hadn't been there before, quiet, lived-in kind of love. Elaine and I didn't speak often about marriage after that day by the lake. Not because it wasn't on our minds, but because there was no urgency to it. The question had already been asked, and the answer already given. What remained was simply the living of that answer. In small ways, we started merging more of our lives. I moved a few more tools into the garage. She cleared a drawer for my clothes without asking. We built a raised herb garden together by the kitchen window and spent a Saturday morning laughing as we argued over which plants should go where. She made space for me in her world, not by rearranging her life entirely, but by widening it just enough for me to fit without forcing anything. That was her gift, making room without losing herself. When summer arrived, so did the town's annual festival. Elaine hadn't attended in years, Said it brought back too many memories of when she and Patrick used to volunteer together, handing out cold lemonade under the white tents. But this year, something shifted. She pulled out a sundress that hadn't seen daylight in a long time and slipped her arm through mine as we walked through the crowd like two people who belonged, no longer defined by absence but by quiet presence. People noticed. There were lingering looks, knowing nods, even a few bold comments from neighbors who'd seen the transformation unfold from a distance. Let Elaine handled it all with that signature grace of hers. Not defensive, not overly proud, just comfortable, like someone who had finally come home to herself. That night, we sat on a picnic blanket beneath the stars while a local band played soft blues in the background. The glow of string lights danced in her eyes, and her head rested gently on my shoulder. Around us, laughter spilled from families and couples, the sounds of summer wrapping around us like a familiar tune. I used to think I only had one love story in me, she whispered. I turned slightly, brushing her hair away from her face. And now? She smiled. Now I think maybe love isn't about how many chapters we get. It's about learning how to write again. We didn't need rings that night. We didn't need vows. What we had was enough. A shared breath, a shared future, and a peace that settled deep in the bones. We'd both lived lives before each other lives, filled with joy, pain, loss, and growth. And yet here we were, not replacing what came before, but building on top of it. Respectfully, tenderly, fully awake to everything that had brought us here. As the music wound down and the crowd began to drift toward their cars, Elaine squeezed my hand and said, "Let's walk home." So we did. Not as strangers. Not as guests in each other's stories, but as co-authors of whatever came next. Up next, we've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.